Right. You're listening to Monday's Dash AM, where it's time for today's edition of A History of Waterford in 20 Objects with Mark Power.
Well, first of all, there's three stories really come to mind that we all absolutely believed, and there's a shade of doubt about them, but we'll say that they happened.
The Victorian age. Prudery, respectability, stiff clothes and stiffer morals. The age of conservatism and conformity. But it was also the age of romanticism, of the Gothic, of the Byronic hero and the mad women in the attic. Underneath the cold ice of conformity bubbled intense emotions. All that repression needed an outlet, and it found it in opera. Waterford's William Vincent Wallace lived one of the more adventurous Victorian lives, and he wrote his own soundtrack.
Harp, 19th century.
The Waterford merchant class developed a particular fondness for musical theatre during the city's Georgian expansion. It was a taste that spread throughout the city. Local historian Dermot Power has written about the very busy theatre scene in Waterford around the time Wallace was born here in 1812.
There was a huge amount of theatres around, both big and small. If we just go, we say from the present theatre, that was started at 1784. There was a playhouse there. Right across the road from that, in what was the Corporation Yard in Bolton Street. In 1735, we find that a guy called Mr. Seymour had bought it and planned to turn it into a theatre, which he did. And the very famous Waterford-born Shakespearean actor, Charles Keane, performed there in 1835. It was the only place in Waterford ever performed. And then we move up the road then, up to where my generation would have known as the Olympia. It's now rapid cabs down there. But that was the Beresford Street Theatre Royal. That was opened in the 1840s. And again, there were small theatres. One fascinating name I came across, Cavagna's Cheap Theatre. Now, I'd love to know how cheap. There was no price on it, but there was an ad. So if we come back down along the quay then, you had the Market House, which used to be, there was a garage there. Before that garage was built, opposite Dooley's Hotel was a Market House. That was a theatre.
William Wallace was born into this city in 1812, the son of a musical father, the conductor of a military band. It gave him his introduction to music, as Maureen Fitzgerald of the Friends of Wallace Society explains.
He had every opportunity to play instruments, learn instruments, and actually compose small pieces of music. So by the time he came back to Waterford, which he did come back in his teen years, he was a very proficient musician, and he learned to play the organ, of which he was very famous for, and he learned to play the organ in Waterford Christchurch Cathedral, and it was Mr. Ringrose that taught him. And when they then went to Dublin, the whole family moved to Dublin. The father and his brother, Wellington, played in one of the orchestras in Dublin, and William himself became second violinist in the Theatre Royal Orchestra, and he also continued to learn to play the organ in Dublin as well, and became extremely proficient with his music, and composed pieces, and was acclaimed very highly in Dublin. So it was through the fact that he was an organist in Dublin in the Pro Cathedral and other places that he discovered that there was a wonderful position going down in Thurles in the Ursuline convent. And he would then be director of music, and he would teach the pupils.
It was in Thurles that Wallace connected to the harp that's now in the museum. It wasn't the only connection he made there, as Donegal O'Kellicon of the Waterford Museum of Treasures explains.
Well, this is one of the most interesting objects we have here in the museum. It's a harp made by Egan's of Dublin, probably one of the most famous harp makers in the country. There are only about 50 of them left, I'd say. This is one of them. It's a very, very rare object. You see, it's beautifully gilded, beautifully carved, and this harp was used by William Vincent Wallace, the famous Waterford composer and perhaps Ireland's most important 19th century composer. This is the harp he used to teach in the Ursuline Convent in Thurles, County Tipperary. And, believe it or not, it was playing this harp that he met his future wife. Her name was Isabella Kelly, and she was actually a novice nun in the convent at the time. And, believe it or not, he was teaching her to play the harp, and I suppose you could say the rest is history. They fell in love and married.
You have a novice nun and a Protestant man. Presumably that was scandalous, was it? Or how did that relationship play out?
It wasn't a popular love match either with her family or with his, as you can imagine, in the 19th century. However, I suppose the story doesn't end there, because Wallace himself actually converted to Catholicism in order to marry Isabella. And he's now known today as William Vincent Wallace, and when he was born he was just christened just simply William Wallace. And where did the Vincent come from? Well, the Vincent actually was a name he took when he was baptised as a Catholic, when he sort of converted, and it was in honour of the Reverend Mother of the Ursuline Convent in Thurles at the time. She was Mother Vincent, and that was her religious name, and in honour of her he took the name Vincent as well. So I suppose that's how we know him today now as William Vincent Wallace.
Despite this shockingly romantic episode and a sequence of subsequent adventures, of which more later, Wallace was an incredibly hard-working musician, and that led to the premiere of the opera Maritza at Covent Garden in 1845, while still in his early 30s.
While he was in Dublin, in his early days now, Paganini visited Dublin on a special tour and played in the Theatre Royal. Now, he was considered a wizard and he had a 2-string violin which he played. It was an amazing man, and Wallace was totally bowled over, and he did his best to copy him, and he did really actually succeed, because he certainly was well able to play the violin, there's no doubt about that. And he totally gave his life to music. So he had his adventures, but it was his operas that made him really, really famous in the final end of it, because music just sort of poured out of him. The librettists, there was a Fitzgerald was one of his librettists, and when Maritza went on in London, it just brought the house down. It was such a success that there was known to have 9 curtain calls.
Maritza also marked the beginning of his rivalry with William Balfe.
One of his great friends, I suppose, if you could call it that, friend and rival in this period, was another Irish composer, William Balfe. Balfe, known for, say, pieces like the Bohemian Girl. Some of his stuff still played today. But Balfe and himself were friends, but also rivals. And interestingly, we have on display as well a little snuff box which was presented to Wallace by Balfe on the opening night of Maritza. We also have a letter which was also donated to us, which is very, very prized possession here, a letter in which Wallace refers to Balfe and the rivalry between them, where he writes, he was working on one of his operas, The Amber Witch, at the time, and he says in the letter, I met Balfe the other day, and he's working on a piece which is going to be performed in Covent Garden when The Amber Witch comes out. So he said, he ends by saying, let the best man win.
Wallace died in 1865, but remained popular for a time afterwards. This popularity, however, did eventually wane.
In the end, his health gave up, and he went to live for a time in Paris, where they treated him for his eyes, and then from Paris he got very ill, and he was brought to the south of France, and he died in the south of France eventually, and his body was brought back to London and buried in Kensal Green in London. And some years ago, our friends of Wallace in Waterford and the City Council, between us, we put the money together to erect a headstone. He didn't have a headstone, and that's sitting proudly there in London now to tell the story, and hopefully it will lead people to Waterford.
The operas were very popular. You were making a point, though, that a lot of the music is a bit tricky.
Yes, his fashion of writing was kind of difficult at times, and we have found from experience when we've been asking for pieces to be played, pieces that we have of his to be played, it's been discovered that it's quite really difficult to play, and our own Niall Crowley in Waterford has actually altered the overture to Maritza in order that it can be played easily for young people to be able to play his music, which we're very grateful for. It's wonderful.
Difficult in a way for us to think back to the 19th century, but you had, I suppose it was really the era of opera, and opera, I suppose, was essentially, the pop music of its day, You had composers like, say, for example, Rossini, Verdi, etc. They were the superstars of the day, So it's interesting that our William Vincent Wallace was right up there among them, at a time when people didn't travel maybe more than 20 miles from where they were born. He travelled the world, and always came back to Ireland, came back to Waterford as well. But I suppose essentially he was an international character, an international figure at the time, exceptionally well known. He was a great favourite, believe it or not, of Queen Victoria. She admired his work, and in his honour, Queen Victoria commissioned a medallion to be made in the Royal Mint in London. And in total there were only 5 copies of this medallion made, and one was kept in Buckingham Palace, and one was sent to the Emperor of Russia, another to the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, one to the King of Prussia, and the final copy was given to Wallace himself. Now he presented that to his New York publishers, and they still have it today.
What about the tales surrounding Wallace? His life story is almost as appealing as his music. Like Mar of the Sword, he was a man of action, if not always a man of plans.
There's 3 stories really come to mind that we all absolutely believed, and there's a shade of doubt about them, but we'll say that they happened. The first one was that he went to India, on the sailing ships would be calling into the ports, and reloading and all this sort of thing, and he went off anyway to hunt tigers. And the person that was with him on the elephant was young King Leopold of Belgium. And it seems that apparently a tiger sprang at them, and only for William shooting the tiger successfully, King Leopold would have been killed. And he was extremely grateful to William, presented him with a beautiful ring, which he always wore on his little finger. You'd see it in some of the pictures of him, actually. That now was one of the famous stories about him. The other one was when he left Australia and wanted to go to South America via New Zealand, and the boat that he took across to New Zealand was a whaling ship, and they were doing the whaling, then he was on board, and then there was a mutiny, and then he and the cook were put into a boat and told, get the heck out of it, you have nothing to do with us, and he was reputedly picked up by Maoris and brought to their king, and she fell in love with him and his beautiful music. Of course, he enchanted them all with his violin, and she wanted him to stay with her and marry her, and he did actually have to marry her in their right in order to please the situation and save his life. So anyway, it seems that apparently he did escape. Not before she cut him across the chest with her knife, a big cross shape on his chest, which he proudly showed to people ever after, because he had the scar from it. But he did escape and managed to get his way to South America. So certainly there must be an element of truth in all that, because he always had the scar and he would hardly do it himself. So anyway. Now, the third thing was another adventure that he had was in South America. He was down we all know about the show boats and the big boats that went up and down the rivers there. And one of the ladies came along and said to him, "Oh, Mr. Wallace, will you come down and play for us, please?" And he went down. Of course, he was very popular with the ladies, and he was very obliging. So he went down into the salon to play to them. And while they were down there, the chimney blew up on the boat and caused a tremendous amount of damage and bodies in the river and all the rest of it, and he spent the rest of the day swimming around trying to save people out of the river. So he had adventures. He really was an adventurous man, and he put himself in the way of getting into difficulties, but he got out of them again. That was the good thing.
A History of Waterford in 20 Objects is part financed by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland's Sound and Vision scheme. And of course it is written, produced and presented by Mark Power.